Hello, and welcome back to Dialogues with Creators. This is the first episode of 2025 and one of the last in my third year of producing this podcast since April of 2022. I've had over 60 episodes so far and spoken with over 50 people. I want this one to be unique and worth my time to create, and definitely worth your time to listen to. And I believe it is both. Please listen in on this conversation with Dr. John Fuchko, 6th president of Dalton State College. We spoke one early January morning before the semester started, and I found it a fascinating talk. Dr. John Fuchko III was named the 6th president of Dalton State College in October 2023, and he was officially installed in April of 2024. Before that October date, Dr. Fuchko assumed the interim position at Dalton State in June when Dr. Margaret H. Venable retired after 8 years of service. Immediately prior to coming to Dalton State during the 2022-23 academic year, Dr. Fuchko was interim president at Columbus State University, where he led an effort to address a projected $9 million budget reduction, not fun, and helped champion a focus on student retention. That, and this is pretty amazing, anybody that knows these kinds of numbers will recognize it, in an almost 5% retention rate increase from fall 21 to fall 22. Dr. Fuchko has taken on leadership roles in multiple organizational areas during his 17 years with the University System of Georgia, including service as Vice Chancellor for Organizational Effectiveness, overseeing strategic implementation, accreditation, athletics, ethics, and risk, and various other administrative duties. A Georgia native, Dr. Fuchko joined the staff of the University System of Georgia's Office of Internal Audits in July of 2006. He previously served as the system's Chief Audit Officer and Vice Chancellor for Internal Audit, which included responsibility for 25 campus audit shops and 80 professional staff. He oversaw the system's compliance program, enterprise risk management initiative, and the development of the USG's ethics policy. John Fuchko has also spent time in the business world, having served as a financial representative for Northwestern Mutual Financial Network and as a director of planning and budget for a small manufacturer. He is a certified internal auditor, certified compliance and ethics professional, and a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt. And some of you may think that has to do with martial arts, but it has to do with internal auditing and processes of organizations. As a decorated colonel in the Georgia Army National Guard, John Fuchko commands the 122nd Regiment Regional Training Institute. His 2 decades of service have included roles such as battalion commander for the 221st Expeditionary Military Intelligence Battalion and 2 deployments to the Middle East. John Fuchko is a graduate of the 2018 Leadership Atlanta class and a recipient of the 40 Under 40 recognition from both Georgia Trend and the Atlanta Business Chronicle. He regularly speaks on internal audit, governance, and higher education topics, and has delivered convocation keynotes at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and South Georgia State College. He's also been an officer and board member for several nonprofits, including service as a trustee at his parish, Epiphany Byzantine Catholic Church, and as chair of the Center for Family Resources. Dr. Fuchko holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the Kennesaw State University. He earned a Master of Business Administration at Georgia State University, a master's degree in strategic intelligence at the National Intelligence University, a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College, and a doctorate in education at the University of Georgia. Go Bulldogs. As you can see, Dr. Fuchko has many, many accomplishments and a rich professional background. But I would guess that the high point of his life is his family. He and his wife, Cherie, have 12 preschool-aged to adult children. It is my honor and privilege to speak today with Dr. John Fuchko. Welcome to Dialogues with Creators, Dr. John Fuchko, for a discussion of leadership, creativity, and your wisdom and experience on both subjects. I'd like to start by getting your take on some sayings and maybe they're cliches about leadership. Is that okay?
Let's do it.
Okay. One of the ones that we hear a lot are leaders aren't born, they are made.
Yes, we've heard that one. You know, I don't know if you read War and Peace, but War and Peace kind of explores this dynamic that the main character is trying to figure out. Was Napoleon, did he produce the situation in which he was in, where he was quote unquote a great man, or were circumstances kind of all conspired and they produced this great man, right? And I don't know that we really know the answer to those questions. It comes up again, this whole nature or nurture sort of concept that just in any individual's life, right? Because everybody leads or in some capacity or another. But I guess my answer to that would be, I don't think any of us are entirely blank slates. We have tendencies to do things. Some of those things are good. Some of those things are not so good. And then there's probably all sorts of things in between. I think leaders make a difference, period. And they do that in a way that's either good or bad. But it's really never all one or the other. I think you can almost think about it that they'll do things that impact other people, right? And that's one of the first things I think is they impact individuals. And I think maybe we're born to do that as humans, but learning to do that in a way that's helpful is something that some people just intuitively get, and then some people have to study and think about it and be deliberate, right? Because sometimes people tend towards selfishness. I think leaders are probably good at drawing out implications of what's going on in a particular situation, or what does this really mean? Okay, so we're all working on this stuff. We all kind of are pursuing our own goals and objectives that are tied to whatever larger goals and objectives. These things all should kind of nest within each other. But sometimes we don't always step back and kind of think about what are the implications for this in a larger sort of way. And I think a good leader thinks about those things, calls them out, and sometimes we'll call things out as good or as bad. And that could be a difference as well. One of the, I remember as a kid hearing about, one of these attacks. I think it was in New York City, perhaps, and listening to a description of people kind of standing around watching, I think, a lady being attacked or something.
Yes. It's Jenna's story.
Yes. And I remember, and then I was probably a teenager, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to be in a situation where I'm standing around watching, assuming somebody else is going to do what needs to be done, or, looking back and saying, well, I wish I would have done something about that. Wasn't that horrible? And that really has kind of informed my instincts about things. I'll give you a silly example. I was at the investiture for Kyle Marrero was president of Georgia Southern University. And Kyle and his wife are both extremely accomplished musicians, probably globally known in the world of opera singing anyway. And they had music as a big part of their ceremony. And I happened to be sitting on the front row, and a clean line of sight, probably about 25 feet away, 30 feet away, to a choir. And there was an older gentleman who was kind of conducting the choir, but he was up on this kind of somewhat makeshift sort of stand. And I remember looking at him saying, here's this stand. And he has his music stand, which was a little boxy, but not super stable. And then there's a speaker boom right next to it. And I'm going through my head and I'm like, you know what? He's going to lose his balance. He's going to reach out and knock over his stand. The stand is going to knock into the speaker boom, and the speaker boom is going to fall on the young ladies who were there singing. And I had the whole thing in my head. I'm like, this is likely to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, he finishes his piece, he starts to turn around and that whole sequence of events starts happening. And I jumped out of my chair. I was in my suit, jumped out of my chair, caught the speaker boom as it was about 2 feet from falling on the first young lady, set it aright, and was back in my chair. And I'm not bragging on myself, but that was the way I trained myself to think, was think about what are the implications and then be prepared to actually do something about it. And I think, that was a very kind of tactical sort of situation, but I think a leader, and this is not something you're born with. This is something that has to happen over time with experience, sometimes not good experiences, by the way, needs to have that wisdom to kind of think about what does the future look like? What is the now, and how does that future and the now interact? And then ultimately, and this is something that maybe in higher ed we don't always get totally comfortable with, is you do have to decide. You can't wait for all the perfect information and everything to line up and everybody to be perfectly happy. You could do things to make that more likely, but at some point you do have to decide. And so, the decision-making process and how you think about that and the art and the science of it I don't think is a born trait. I think is something that very much comes with experience. I will tell you one book that I read that, and it's funny because you kind of mentioned, creators, is in the title, right, of the podcast. But one of my favorite books is Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership by Bowman and Deal. And I read that at a relatively early stage in my career. And I was like, this was just such a neat way of thinking about organizations in ways that you might not otherwise think about them, right? We all kind of have a tendency to a certain frame. And the point of this book was, no, there's multiple, I think they had 4 frames that you could kind of look at. And I really tried to take that to heart because I might have a tendency to look at things in a certain way. And I found that book helped me to expand my thinking to say, I'm not going to just look at this as as an auditor, prior auditor, I might be inclined to look at things from a policy and procedure perspective, which is kind of one of the frames, right? But, they talk about other frames. They talk about, the symbolic frame, which we don't always think about in organizations, including in higher ed, that we have all sorts of symbols that we like to pull out at graduation and other things. So long answer to an initial question, but hopefully it provides a little bit of a framework too for maybe some of our conversation.
Yes. And actually I have some comments because it's interesting you bring up Napoleon, because I've tried to understand Napoleon, and it's like, how did the guy become, he's not a guy, obviously, but how did he become who he was? He was sort of a low-level soldier and he moved his way up. So he must have had a certain vision of himself and France and everything else. And of course, it was at a time, very chaotic time in French history. But I've just always he seems so unclear to me as to how he got to where he was. Obviously, big ego.
Yes. That didn't hurt, did it? Or maybe it did.
Yeah. That's the time. And, some of the other things you brought up were very interesting. I think there is a sense that there has to be an aha moment a little bit for someone to say, if I see things differently as a leader, I see that things don't have to be this way, or things are a problem, or that I can change them, or I can, have a proactive vision or something. And so there is some self-awareness or something like that. Another statement is from a book that, was Seth Godin. His leaders eat last.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually our dean gave us that to read, and I read some of it and I liked some, and others I was like, but because he talks about the organization as a family, and I was sort of like, well, yes, I see that, but organizations aren't really families. No, you don't fire your family members. Fire your kids when they're not doing the right thing. So I wasn't too sure about that, but he had some good ideas. But anyway, leaders eat last.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very much a military, I think it was a military writer who probably wrote that book. And that really ties to this idea of servant leadership, right? It's putting the needs of other people and their good, their welfare, their well-being ahead of your own, which in a family, I mean, is the same sort of responsibility, right? I mean, and that's one of those things, as a husband, as a father, I should be being sacrificial to my wife, but my wife is also sacrificial to me, and we're both sacrificing for the children, but then the children are also in some way sacrificing themselves, right? Because they don't have all the autonomy and the independence and the will to do everything that they possibly want to do. So they're actually having to sacrifice. So I think, yes, leaders eat last. I think one needs to put others first. But I honestly think in most organizations, there's actually a mutual sort of leaders eat last that happens across the entire organization. And I think sometimes if a leader doesn't remember that, then that can be a problem, right? Because they start to overvalue their own sort of sacrifices and maybe to be unaware or undervalue the sacrifices of other people. And particularly in a organizational setting, you're paid for what you do, right? So, if I, as the president of a college, or the commanding officer of a unit, which I am on the Army side, like I eat last, but I'm also the most highly compensated person in many respects in the room, right? So, and I wouldn't be able to do any of the things that I do without all the other people in the room. So, who are sacrificing their own way. So I think in some ways I like the leaders eat last concept, but I also kind of say everybody in that sense almost is a leader that is leading in their own space, and they are sacrificing for others. And so when you can, and it's mostly symbolic at that point, but when you can kind of do some of those things that are, frankly, at the end of the day, a slight discomfort to you, but can at least be a way of showing some appreciation, that can be useful. But, I think there's a deeper piece that goes into that. And it's kind of like, well, what are you doing while you're eating last? Right. So, part of the idea is you're using that time to ideally take the temperature of people who are in the room, because, eating, the communal experience of eating, the just kind of letting down of the professional sort of answers and being able to have a more even intimate sort of conversation with somebody was a lot more likely in a setting with food than in a setting without food, right? So sometimes if you're just eating last and you're standing off, looking at your phone, what's the point? But if you're eating last and you're using that time to engage with other people at a point when people's shields are down, then I think it can be a leadership activity at that point. And the other piece is you are actually able to sit back and observe, and you can learn a lot about an organization from when they do come together as a group. How do they engage? What's the chancellor sometimes talked about? What's the aura? What's the essence? What's the fragrance on a campus? And so I find sometimes those it can be really useful experiences to, because you're not busy worrying about what you're going to eat or what's in your teeth after you just ate something, but you're instead kind of just taking it in and observing people. I think that can be a really useful leadership activity as well. And you don't get a lot of opportunities to do that, particularly in larger and larger settings.
Mm-hmm. Here's one that I used to hear a lot. I don't know if it's as common as everything rises or falls on leadership. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah, about that. I've heard it. I think that, people that kind of makes you feel like you're irreplaceable, as a leader and you're not. One of the former chancellors, Errol Davis, had a saying. He's like, if you really want to know how important you are, try to telling somebody else's dog what to do. If any one of us stop showing up, classes are still going to be taught. Admissions is still going to be going on. Financial aid is still going to be processed. The core activities of the college, university, the military, the business, those things are all still going to happen. And so now leaders can absolutely make a huge difference within that. But I personally get a little bit, I don't know, the hairs go up a little bit on the back of my head when I hear that particular saying, because I just feel like it communicates this sort of leadership centric, ego-centric model that I just don't think is very healthy.
Yes, I appreciate that. I used to work in a place where that was said all the time, and it just, me too. I remember Errol Davis. He was the chancellor when I first started working in the system. And he had another saying. He said, "When we talk about timelines, you all look at your calendars, and I look at my watch." And I like that one because I have often been frustrated with the slowness of things we do in academia, which maybe we'll come back to. But it's like, does it really have to be this slow? Do we really have to take this long to get this done? Yeah. This is one that's on the School of Business's wall. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way, which rhymes.
Yeah. I mean, there's elements of truth in all of those things, right? I mean, if you kind of break it down, I guess I would say how on each of them, right? So knowing the way, I mean, that kind of goes in somewhat to what I was talking about earlier in terms of having the wisdom to think about the future. But sometimes if you're the only person out front, it's because you're a visionary leader. Other times it's because you're lost.
Yeah.
Right. So you really have to exercise some humility around that. And truly, one, value other people's thoughts and perspectives, not because they necessarily are always right. Sometimes people are wrong, right? But usually there's going to be something in there that's going to sharpen your own perspective that you need to kind of draw out, and you will then know the way in a way that's a little bit more reliable and probably a little bit more fulsome than if it's just like some sort of vision that's handed down to you. Showing the way, absolutely, right, and that's kind of helping to provide. The military talks about providing purpose, direction, and motivation as part of the role of a leader, right? In fact, the key role of leaders to provide purpose, direction, and motivation, which is kind of, you could apply those three to know the way, show the way, go the way. You do need to be not afraid when it comes to showing what that future might look like. And the way one might go about going there. And then, of course, if you're not personally engaged in it, then why should anybody else? Now, that said, the role that a leader might have could look very different than the role that, in a college setting that, a faculty member might have. Right? And so what, as the president, I might, quote unquote, need a faculty member to do or a department to do. May have very little to do with what I do every day, but I'm still need to be about the business, so to speak, of supporting that direction and moving in that direction and modeling it in those things that I am supposed to be.
And the last one is from Dr. Martin Luther King. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. And I think from what you've said so far, You know, I don't know how much we mold consensus, you know, and how would that happen?
Yeah, I almost think of that, and I'm trying to properly cite it, but I can't in my head. But there's that kind of the idea of you know, thawing and then refreezing and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Right. And I suspect, you know, that might be what Dr. King was referring to was, sometimes I think searching for consensus is very much caught within the context of within the current context, right? It's within the current context. It's not thinking about what the new context ought to be or what it's going to become. And so in that sense, a leader can almost kind of defrost the current context, which is kind of everybody views as frozen and fixed, and move to a different context. So, you know, if you think back to Dr. King's day, when in a world where segregation was the reality, well, you could think about doing things very differently in that context, right? You could, well, we're going to make this separate but equal, but we're going to make it a good experience. Really? You know, or are we going to throw out the entire context of we're going to separate by race, and really start to move to this idea of judging people by the content of their character? You know, Dr. King's, from some of his sayings, which was an entirely different context. And if he had been trying to drive for a consensus within the current construct, then I don't think he would have had nearly the impact that he did, versus he said, no, we need to change this whole construct.
Yeah.
And so I think leaders do actually sometimes sit in that situation and say, what's our context? We need to change this context. I've tried to do that a little bit with our relationship with Georgia Northwestern Technical College and with Georgia Highlands, right? And the natural context, and there's always going to be some truth to this, is competition. You know, we're competing for students. Or we can say, no, the whole context needs to be shifted to think about competing for our community, help our community to win by helping our individuals in it to win and to stay here and be a part of the community. And we can't do that by ourselves. We cannot accomplish that. We don't offer all of the programs that the community and the employers need just at Dalton State College. And so if we want to truly have the impact, we've got to change the context to say, we're going to think about this in a different way. And then that will change the actions. And that's how I tend to think about what that particular saying.
Yeah. In Dr. King's case, I think that he showed that the incongruity or the inconsistency of what we say we are as Americans and the Constitution and what's actually happening, you know. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about too, is we've been in this traditionally, this competition thing with the tech system or another college when, you know, all the boats go up. I can't remember that saying.
Rising tide floats
all boats. Yeah. So we can help each other and not be redundant as well. I think if we're all trying to do the same thing, we're just, you know, we're not going to do it well because we're trying to get the smaller piece of the pie or something, when it comes to students. Okay. So you've probably heard dozens of these kinds of aphorisms in your life. I know you are a leader and you study leadership, and you've been a leader in so many different contexts as far as business, public service, the university system, the military, and as higher education and a president. I have a lot of questions, but we're limited on time. So let's start with this. I think we've addressed it a little bit. What core qualities or characteristics do you consider to be essential to a leader?
Well, and I'm gonna read off some stuff that I actually had written down years ago, and I have a little card in my wallet with me, but that has these. So I'm just going to kind of read some of those that I've written down over the years, and then I might add a few comments. One of those is to break the glass balls, and people were like, what does that really mean? And it's that I think a lot of us are walking around with all of these things that we don't talk about, but they're real, right? Some people maybe see the elephant in the room.
Yeah, that's me.
And this was something I really have to credit my dad with. He was like, just go in there and just kind of like break the glass balls from the start, and then we can have a real conversation. So I think that's one of the qualities of a leader. I think you have to be really self-motivated around others and the needs of others, and caring about others and their good. I think we'll talk more about that later, I hope. Building teams is huge, right? You've got to be in the business of building teams in lots of different teams in a lot of different settings, and be deliberate about doing that. It does not happen by accident. People don't wake up one day and say, you know what, we're going to work as a team, right? And people talk about, the whole form, storm, norm, perform, sort of 4 phases. All of those things imply deliberateness, starting with forming, right? People don't, I don't think you walked in today and said, I think I'm going to go form a team with these 5 people, right? You're in a team as a department chair. And you have your own team, so to speak, and then you have a team that you're a part of with your other chairs, with the dean, and so on and so forth. But all of these teams where there's deliberateness, and sometimes those can be brought together in a deliberate sort of way through retreats and other sort of functions. Other times we just kind of expect it will happen, and it often doesn't. I think you really have to understand the environment in a profound, deep sort of way that you're in. As an intelligence officer, that was always kind of our responsibility in a operational setting, was to help the commander understand the environment. And you had a very specific way you did that. But you really got to have the mental maps in your head, right? In a higher ed setting, you got to think about what's the mental map of, state policymakers, the Board of Regents, the legislature, the governor, and others. What's the federal map of the things that are impacting higher ed and the trends and the kind of big issues that are out there? What's the map of the business owners and the key stakeholders in Northwest Georgia where we serve? And I could just keep going and going and going. If you're just kind of going in and your map is the campus, then you're going to fail. You got to have all these external maps, and then you have to understand the map on the campus. Certainly the physical map, but what are the different units and the key leaders and the players and what are their interests and so on. So understanding the environment is key. Preserving flexibility, but decide. And so, I think this was one of the things that it took the longest to learn, and it's the hardest, but it's, sometimes people think, well, leaders, they just decide. And I referenced that earlier, that, at a certain point you have to decide. But sometimes you got to wait. And sometimes you need to say, you know what, this situation isn't quite ready for that. And that's harder for me probably than for some. My inclination is to decide more quickly. But I know intellectually, and I know in my bones that that's not always the right thing. That sometimes you need to wait and let things develop, and that fruit is truly a low hanging fruit at that point, right? You don't want to pick it when it's not ripe. You don't want to wait till it's a mashed piece of fruit on the ground that you step in and get stung by a bee. You want to get it at right that middle point, and that's something that you have to figure that out. But I think that's a key quality of a leader. Obviously, leaders are transforming the future. When they do that, they're taking some risks, but they're also trusting. They're trusting other people. They're trusting the inherent goodness of what we're trying to do, that will win out. But they're doing it in the concept of they're also taking some risks, right? And when if you say we're going to do this thing, that means you're not doing this other thing. That's taking a risk. But hopefully you're doing it with this idea of transforming the future. And then the final kind of two little not paragraphs here, but little statements that I have. First one is communicate, encourage, execute with discipline, and treat all with respect. So communicate is once again something you have to do very deliberately, and it can't just be one-on-one. It can't just be in large groups. It can't just be verbally. It can't just be in writing, right? You have to do all of those things. Of course, I'm talking to the chair at the Department of Communications et al. But you really have to think about how you communicate that message, whatever that might be. You have to frame it. You have to think about it. And then you have to communicate it in a lot of different ways. You do have to encourage people. And that means figuring out, people used to talk about deposits into the emotional bank account or what somebody's quote unquote love language. Obviously that works really well in a familial relationship, but even in an organizational relationship, figuring out what it is that motivates somebody, what it is that encourages somebody, can become really important. Execution becomes really important as well, right? And if your vision is too caught up in reams of paper and statement and so on, then I think you kind of miss the mark. But on the other hand, if you don't have some really good disciplined way of tracking and being focused on results and what it is that needs to be done and the details of it, it won't get done. And that really does start at the senior level, even if the president. And, I do know there are presidents and CEOs who are kind of like, well, I'll let my people handle all the details. And that works to a point. But you've got to zero in on some details. I don't care if you're the president of a, $10 billion organization or a $100 million organization or a $10 million organization. You've got to manage some of those details and make sure there's some discipline around the culture of how we do things, right? And then treating all with respect is really easy until somebody disagrees with you or they do something stupid or they act in a way that's a little less than human and they're out there bad mouthing you or something else. Then that becomes a little bit harder, right? And you still have to do it. And then finally, I would say use processes and checklists, but do not hide behind them. And so, sometimes we'll get into this where we'll be in a situation, if it's happened at Dalton State, where somebody will say, hey, I don't want to do this. Our policy is X. And I'll be like, but Mr. President, you can make an exception to this, under the policy. And I'll look at it. And sometimes I'll say, yeah, I'm going to make an exception. The policy allows me to make that exception. And inevitably, sometimes somebody will come back and say, well, do we need to change the policy? And I'm like, well, no, the policy says I can make an exception. I'm making an exception. Like that is a part of the policy is that the president can make an exception. It doesn't mean the policy is wrong. It doesn't mean that precedent is irrelevant. But, every situation does tend to be a little bit different. And sometimes you need to, once again, ensure that, you take a little bit of risk and it might be just impacting that person's future in a particular way. But sometimes you need to be aware and ready to do that.
Mm-hmm. And interesting in this, the bringing up the situational. You've been a leader in different kinds of contexts. To what extent is leadership going to be universal or situational? It's going to be different for certain kinds of contexts versus others.
Yeah, I think the principles are the same. I will say in War College, they really kind of reinforce the idea of strategic versus operational leadership. And, it's targeted. War College is for, senior lieutenant colonels who are probably making colonel, and it is required in order to be promoted to flag officer, general officer rank. So 1 star or higher. And kind of their point is, well, the days of directly leading where we're in, you were in more junior roles, right? And that as a colonel or higher, you're probably going to be leading large groups, large organization. A colonel traditionally commands a brigade, which is anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 people. And so your influence is felt less in a direct way and more in an indirect way. But I think a lot of the qualities and attributes that I talked about are still pretty relevant. Just in terms of understanding the environment, you're still helping to provide direction and motivation and purpose. You're just the way that you do that is a little different than the way you might do that as a more junior leader. So a lot of the attributes are the same, but the way in which you'll apply them is different. And the key thing, of course, is that you understand all of it. Because if you don't understand that, then you might try to influence, your faculty senate the same way that you might have influenced your, department that reported to you. Well, those are different organizations and they function differently. So you need to think about how you support them differently, and recognize too that as you get into more senior roles, you're not always the decision maker. You're not always, quote unquote, leading them. You might be influencing them. You might be motivating them. You might be providing leadership in some ways, but it's not your job to necessarily make that decision. Faculty senates are advisory at the end of the day to the president, right? That's their role within the policy structure of the Board of Regents. In addition to participating in shared governance around particularly things like, curriculum and tenure and promotion and so on, some of those campus policies. Well, if they're advisory, we'll let them advise. You don't always need to get there and try to, lead. We're gonna do things a certain way. Well, no, you kind of want to hear their advice, right? I mean, that's what they're there to do, and many times you're going to want to follow it pretty closely to what they produced out of their process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at the faculty senate. And that brings me to the question. Right now you're still in the military, but you're leading in a higher educational context as a president of a state college, which is of course going to be different from a public and a private college or other. But what are some of the unique challenges to leadership in higher ed at this time? And I know that you're an expert. Yeah. And I'm always interested in this subject.
I think externally, there's a lack of confidence maybe in higher education in terms of what we do for a person in the community. I think if people believe that we did what we purport to do, they would be literally beating down the doors to come. But I think that in many cases, and I'm not saying this is true, I don't think it's true at Dalton State. It may be true in some settings, but I think our own perspective of what we do, transforming lives, of helping people to appreciate, creation, the liberal arts, the humanities, the sciences, improve their thinking, improve their ability to live a more full life, a more fulfilled life, and to contribute in a meaningful way to their communities, whether that's in the business sector or that's in the nonprofit sector, or it's in healthcare, it's in education. It's just in their own, how they lead their own families and build those up. I think if people believed that we were doing all of that the way we ought to be in their mind, they would literally be beating down the doors to come, right? But I think sometimes we get in our own way in that respect. And some of it's tied to our strengths, right? So, internally, I think some of those challenges is that this respect that we have for different views and beliefs, which is really kind of core to the academic freedom, can devolve into this almost an absolute relativism, right? Where we say every idea has equal worth, every view has equal worth, every perspective is equally true. Well, that's not actually the case, right? There are some things that, and I think if we sat back and thought about it, we say, well, that's not right. Treating somebody that way, that's not right. Treating somebody this way, that's right. But we have to recognize that we still have to respect the fact that different people are going to have different views about those things when you get into particularly when you get into the particulars. But I think sometimes we get so far on the respect for views perspective that we sometimes miss the opportunity to say, well, you know what, there are certain things that probably we need to be a little bit more clear about. And from the outside, people look at it and say, hey, if you can't call a spade, then, why would I send my kid here? I've tried to raise them with that understanding. And we say, well, that's not exactly our role, but yet there are some things that we ought to be thinking about in terms of how we think about people's framing of the world and thinking about how do you think through what makes something right or wrong. Yeah, you might come to a different conclusion than I might, but do we even talk about it in that way of helping somebody to come to those conclusions? I think we have different ways of knowing. So, the scientific method is pretty bedrock, right? But it's most appropriate in the sciences. The scientific method doesn't necessarily work if you're talking about philosophy or theology or art. But those are all valid. And theology and philosophy and art have been around just as long, if not longer, as an academic discipline than many of the sciences. The sciences are relatively new on the block, right? And in the ancient order of precedence of disciplines, they were not at the top. But particularly the German model of higher education really reinforced the sciences and the research sort of component, as opposed to more kind of the Oxford model. And we're kind of a blend of the two, but probably more to the German model in the U.S. Nowadays anyway. But how do we address kind of the role of beliefs? How do we teach critical thinking without making it seem more like being just skeptics about everything, right? And so these are all things that I'm probably going to get my, teaching a class card revoked for even bringing it up in some ways. But the average person, and I talk to a lot of people in our community about their thoughts on college and on Dalton State and on higher ed. And whenever I hear things that kind of like, I just don't see the point, right? And it's very rarely tied to anything that's ever happened to them at Dalton State. It's tied to things they've read about or other people talking about or so on and so forth. But, if you went out there and told the average person the only thing that you can possibly know are things that can be supported by a scientific method, every view is equal, there's really no right and wrong, so on, so on, and so on and so forth. They'd be like, why would I possibly send my child into that environment? So we have to do a little better job, I think, of explaining the value of those approaches, but at the same time recognize that if everybody out there, quote unquote, is thinking a certain way, maybe we also need to think a little bit about how we're communicating what we're doing. And are we really approaching this the way we ought to be, in a way that's going to really engage those people's moral imagination and their thoughts and their perspectives and who they are, and helping them to become who they're supposed to be. So, and finally, I think the purpose of the core, and are we achieving it? And I'm not speaking so much to the Principle 8 assessments within SAC-COC, that certainly is important. But what is the fundamental underlying purpose of the core curriculum? What is it? And are we helping to achieve that with our students? I happen to think the core is one of the most important things that we do. And it's universal, should be, to all of our students, right? But I think we think about it in a very discipline specific sort of way. And then, of course, within a given discipline, it's very particular to probably that instructor, that faculty member. And that's very appropriate in some ways from an academic freedom perspective. But I also sometimes wonder and am concerned that we might be producing a whole range of outcomes because we're so differentiated in how we go about approaching some of the cores. And I think that's something we got to think about. I think it's a challenge for higher ed that we got to deal with.
Yeah. One book I read a few years ago, it was suggested by the provost at the time, is the book Tribal Leadership. I don't know if you know that book.
I'm not familiar with that book, no.
Yeah. But it was, I applied it to higher ed, and it was the idea that there are different levels of commitment or how people see themselves in organizations as a tribe. And it became very clear to me that most professors and people who work in higher ed are at a certain level. It's very It's very individualistic. They don't see themselves as a part of a bigger picture or a bigger mission or something. And part of that is because of the incentive structure of being a professor, which is very individualistic. You get tenure, you're on your own. And some disciplines are a little bit better as far as having, pushing teamwork for publication and things like that. But that is very much you're yourself, you individually are doing this, and it's about your career, and the bigger picture is not that relevant. It's just kind of as a background.
Yeah.
And I see that, it really, it had a lot of impact on me because I saw that for me, I see that as a big, barrier, struggle, problem, whatever you want to call it, to higher education. Even when you hear on the news about these bigger universities and some of the stuff that goes on at them and the political stuff and all, that it's, I have academic freedom. I can say whatever I want in the classroom, which of course we know is not true, but there's limits to everything. But that that we're so individualized in our viewpoints about everything, and that the young people who come to us are the same, that they don't see that your vision of the, what higher education and the core curriculum can do for you as a person within a community and a framework in a society. They see it as me. Yep. I want it my way. I want the best job. I want to make money. I want to, and they have sometimes incorrect ideas of how much money they're going to make at anything. They're just so focused on the individualism versus, and I just see that as such an issue that we deal with, and in higher ed, which I don't think is in military would be as big a deal, because there's so much emphasis on the team and the whole purpose, and they translate that better than we do in higher ed. We don't do it well.
Yeah. And it's hard for us, but I mean, it's wrapped up in the words, I need to get through the core.
Yeah.
And it's the core is something to get through, right? The core is fundamental to preparing people. But to your point, if on the college side, we're approaching the cores, we're achieving these impact sort of core questions, no pun intended. But it's really all over the map on how we go about doing it. People walk out and it's like, well, have we really helped answer that question? I shared an article, I think it's from the Wall Street Journal. It was called "Can Great Books Heal Our Divided Campuses?" And it was obviously there's a few institutions out there that are truly, the entire curriculum is essentially 4 years of, of great works of literature. But even outside of that, some of the institutions would just say, we're going to explore one or two questions, and everybody is going to explore these one or two questions as a part of the first year experience. And they found ways to do that. And I think that might be something that perhaps as we get into our own strategic plan implementation that I'm going to be looking to hopefully implement with some good feedback from our faculty and from our students, is what are some of those things that maybe we can collectively wrestle with as a community of scholars and learners.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. And that brings me to the strategic plan. I had been on the strategic planning committee in 2016, and this was an entirely different process. Had you used this approach that we used in the fall before, or where did you develop the way we developed the strategic plan?
So I've obviously been involved in a lot of strategic planning over the years, most of that at the university system level, and was in the room for the last couple of those efforts. I'll tell you really where it was the same was the team that I used, which was this combination of Rick and Terry, and then Annie Hunt Burris, who I've known Annie Hunt Burris since I was a student. She's been a leader in the state in a lot of different ways, and Annie has known Rick, and how they met is a really interesting story too, but for another time. But Annie had come to visit me at Columbus State and was seeing some of the stuff I was dealing with there, and had some really good experiences in Columbus, Georgia, as a part of ICAP. And we just really almost fell into it. And it was in a point of timing where, I was hearing from a lot of the foundation trustees there in Columbus that, where's the direction? Where's the strategy? What's where are we going? And I'm like, hey, I'm the interim, and I'm not applying to apply for permanent. But I also recognize that, there was some degree to which having, some motivation around the future could be really helpful to an incoming president. And so we really kind of timed a process there, which ended up, we called it Better Together, which was different than what we did at Dalton, but it used some of the same players, and it was used some of the same principles. So kind of the rapid iteration, getting people in the room, and some of those dynamics were there. And it was really wonderful because in Columbus, we kind of got the table set and just in time for when Dr. Rayfield was named president, and she was able to be there. That was one of her first introductions to campus, which was I was really excited about, because I felt like I'd been able to kind of build something up and then hand over something to a colleague that I had a lot of respect and care for, and to give her a really nice kind of platform from which to launch and then do her more in-depth strategic planning later. And so I really got a lot of respect, though, for Rick and Terry and for Annie as a part of that. And as I got into Dalton State and then moved into a spot where I was chose to and then selected for the non-interim role as president, is I always hesitate to say permanent because none of these things are ever permanent, right? In that sense, but in certainly in the role that I'm in now, I was like, okay, well, I know our strategic plan is expiring. And I knew I was not interested in a, multi-committee, year-long sort of process with a lot of, kitchen sink sort of approach, which I just feel like a lot of strategic plans inevitably end up becoming. And I think that's because they're generally internally driven. And I felt like we exist to serve at the end of the day. We exist to serve our community. We certainly serve in the creation of knowledge, transfer of knowledge, application of knowledge, but all that's in the context of serving our students and our community. And I just kind of, I guess felt in my bones that we really needed to deliberately connect those things, right? What are the communities? What is it that they see as their needs? And so I really wanted an extremely driven vision and priorities, but an internally informed approach. And so one of the terms that Rick and Terry use is it's got to be fit for purpose. And so a lot of our conversation before we ever walked in the room was around building a fit for purpose approach, which I felt like this was designed to achieve that purpose. And the purpose was to have a truly forward-looking, transformational approach to higher education that was going to have that impact within the community and have that impact on our campus. And to do that, we started with our community, and then we moved to really getting that information from the campus. And in the process, which is very deliberately, look, we're not going to break into 20 different groups and write long reports and so on and so forth. We all know nobody reads those. So I wanted something that people legitimately would read and interact with. Yeah. And I knew I might lose a little bit of richness of explanation by restricting something to a page or 2 pages or whatever versus 20 or 30 pages. But I felt like the risk of that was made up for by the potential benefit of actually engaging with that one page and creating some shared meaning and vision around that. And I think we did that, and we've got to implement it. And that will be where a lot of the design wisdom or the design flaws will come out. But I do think it's a flexible enough process that we'll be able to pivot as we need to hit the highest priority activities that support that vision and that mission.
Yes, I have to say that I was very thankful that I got to be on that team, and it was so enriching for me to see the dynamic and see the process. I just enjoyed it and was never bored and just thought it was so fascinating what we were doing and the process and things like that. Okay. I do need to bring this to a close. And the last question I had really was about, the idea of agape that came up in your, and, from a Christian viewpoint in my background, that's, it has certain meanings, self-giving love modeled on Christ's sacrifice. Love is more about action than feeling. How do you feel that agape, in your view, fits into the leadership model or role?
Sure. So,
big question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, theologically, I think, your understanding is probably pretty key in terms of, or accurate as far as a theological understanding of the concept. Philosophically, though, which is really more, I guess, the appropriate concept for us as a public institution. I'll note, Aquinas talks about desiring the good of the other, right, as other. But even within the military context, ultimately you have to be prepared for sacrifice, right? And people say all the time that what motivates a soldier on the battlefield is the love of their battle buddy, the person next to them, as opposed to really much of anything else. And we're certainly not asking anybody to, sacrifice in that sort of way in higher ed, or we shouldn't be. But we do, as I kind of started out at the beginning of our conversation, leadership is really about sacrifice. At the end of the day, we're all sacrificing something, and we're all leading in that context, right? A faculty member who is taking their time to grade and provide input to a student is sacrificing their time that they could be spent doing other things. And that's not always a requirement, right? I see our faculty and our staff all the time engage with our students in ways that they're not required to do. They're not checking a block. They're doing it because they actually care. And to me, that's agape. It's really putting that good of that other person as one of the highest and best goods. And I think be it settled on the term servant leadership in the plan itself. But it's still the same concept, right? It's being other-centered. It's being their good and putting that right at the front of what we do.
Yeah. Okay. Your administrative assistant said that I could ask you some questions. Do you listen to podcasts?
Every once in a while. Not as frequent. I probably listen to Audible books more than I listen to podcasts, but every once in a while I do.
It's probably a good idea. Yeah. What are some books that you would recommend to people on this? You mentioned the book about reframing organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. I think Lincoln, the book on Lincoln by Doris Kearns Godwin is actually a really good book on teams. It's a great history book as well. But I'll give you a sense of what I'm reading right now and tell you a little bit about some stuff that I do. I just finished a vampire book. Kind of vampire meets Father Brown, if you're familiar with it.
Oh, really? Oh, man. Chesterton. I don't know how he'd feel about that.
Well, it was called A Bloody Habit by Eleanor Borg Nicholson. It was a fun little read. It's kind of like a retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but I had fun with that. Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I've been reading that. I'm reading a book on the history of the KGB, which is, as an intelligence officer, it's kind of it'd be interesting. Last Call by Tim Powers, which is kind of a redemption, gambling, Western country book all thrown together. A couple books on spiritual direction, which one of them is The Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. I'm mispronouncing that. It's pretty interesting. Ancestral Shadows by Russell Kirk, which is kind of a haunting book with political philosophy thrown in. And then giving the Washington's birthday speech to the Daughters of the American Revolution, I think Sons of the American Revolution dinner. And so I'm reading Ron Chernow new book on Washington to give me some stuff to consider for that speech. So that's that. You could go back 10 years and it'd probably be a similar mix of types of books. But, I'm looking around my study and our son did a library app and figured out, I think we have 2,500 books in our house. And I think I've read at least 1,800 or 1,900 of them. So it's a pretty broad range of books and types.
Great. Thank you. Those are some ones I will write down, and especially the Chernow books, because the Hamilton book was great. Finally, your music. What's your musical taste?
All over the map. Taylor Swift. I think everybody may know that because the chancellor called me out for that. Tchaikovsky, The Script, Sarah Groves, U2, Better Than Ezra, Switchfoot, Stephen Curtis Chapman. Country music. I mean,
it's eclectic.
There's probably very little that I haven't enjoyed at some level at some point. My wife and many members of my family are very musically talented. Cherie says I can carry a tune. It just happens to be my own tune. And she's like, you need to learn to listen better musically, and then you might be able to actually sing in a way that others would say, oh, that guy can sing in tune. But I do nevertheless enjoy listening to it greatly. So.
Okay. I appreciate your patience with me on the questions at the end. And this has been so fascinating. And, I just appreciate your time, and I've learned so much, got some good titles to look into. And, I appreciate your time, and Happy New Year to you and your beautiful, precious family.
Likewise. And I appreciate you doing this, and certainly appreciate you, Barbara, for your dedication to the college. And I know you, of course, have your planned retirement coming up here, and we'll see how that takes. But it's pretty exciting. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank Dr. John Fuchko, 6th president of Dalton State College, for this conversation. I always love especially to know what people are reading, and I've added some books to my long list of must-reads. As I close, please check out past podcasts. I've spoken with poets and preachers, filmmakers and entrepreneurs, musicians and visual artists, parents and professors, and lots of writers. If you are interested in the creative process and creators, this is the podcast for you. Not all of my guests are famous, and I put that word in quotation marks, but they are all gifted, talented, and hardworking, and creative. This podcast has been a joyous part of my last 3 years. And as always, many, many thanks to Clemencia Villafuerte, producer extraordinaire. Coming up in January and February, solo podcasts by me, or I may turn the tables and let someone interview me for a change. I have some things to say about writing and creativity in teaching and life. Check out my blogs, partsofspeakingpublishing.blogspot.com, and my website blog, barbaragrahamtucker.net. Until next time, think and live creatively.